Within 2 centuries of the first Norse longship beaching on an English shore, men of Scandinavian blood sat on the throne of England, governed the north of France, carved out a kingdom in Sicily that ruled Arabs and Greeks alike, founded the cities that would become Russia, and stood guard, axe in hand, inside the imperial palace in Constantinople. Not as raiders passing through, as kings, founders, and rulers of the medieval world's most consequential states. William the Conqueror, the man who seized England in 1066 and permanently altered its language, its aristocracy, and its destiny, was the great-great-great-grandson of a Viking warlord who arrived in France with nothing but a fleet and a willingness to fight. His followers called themselves Normans, but Normandy means only one thing: the land of the Northmen. The Viking Age did not end. It became the world that followed. Scandinavia in the 8th century was not the frozen wilderness of popular imagination. It was a working world, of farms carved into narrow coastal valleys, of fishing communities perched on the edges of deep fjords, of chieftains who measured their power in land, livestock, and the number of men who owed them loyalty. It was also a world that was running out of room. The geography of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark imposed hard limits on how many people the land could support. In Norway especially, the mountains pressed the habitable land into thin strips along the coast. Every valley that could be farmed already was. Every patch of soil that could sustain a family had a family on it. There was no frontier to push into, no unclaimed interior waiting to be settled. Into this constrained landscape, Norse inheritance law introduced a structural pressure that would eventually crack it open. The eldest son inherited the farm, not a share of it, all of it. Younger sons received whatever their father chose to give them, which in a land-poor household was often very little. A second or third son reaching adulthood in 8th century Norway faced a simple arithmetic. The land was taken, and the law had given it to his brother. These were not men without ability or ambition. They were men without an outlet for either. In a society that measured worth in land and in the capacity to provide for dependents, a landless younger son occupied an uncomfortable position, capable, trained in the use of weapons, accustomed to the sea, and with nothing to show for any of it. The sea was not just a highway for these men. It was an alternative to a life of diminishment. The political landscape of Scandinavia added another pressure from above. During the 8th and 9th centuries, ambitious chieftains across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were consolidating power, absorbing smaller clans, displacing rivals, and building the early structures of what would become kingdoms. Men who had been their own masters found themselves subordinate. Some accepted it, others looked outward. What made looking outward possible was the ship. The Norse longship, refined over generations of maritime culture, was by the late 8th century among the most capable seafaring vessels in the world. Built from overlapping planks of oak held with iron clinker nails, its hull was designed not to resist the ocean but to move with it, bending under pressure rather than breaking, drawing so little water that it could beach directly on a shore or push deep into a river that no other vessel of its size could navigate. The longship carried between 20 and 60 oarsmen and could cover extraordinary distances in open water. It was fast, shallow, and reversible. The prow and stern were identical, so the crew could row away from a coast as quickly as they had approached it. No other maritime culture in early medieval Europe had built anything like it. The longship did not just enable the Viking expansion. In a very real sense, it created the conditions for it. The first recorded Norse landing that announced this capability to the rest of Europe came in the summer of 793, on a small tidal island off the northeast coast of England. Lindisfarne was a monastery, wealthy by the standards of the time, undefended by any military logic, and accessible from the sea. The Norse who came ashore that morning were not acting on impulse. They had scouted, planned, and chosen their target with precision. What followed was swift and overwhelming. The shock that Lindisfarne sent through the Christian world of Europe was not simply about the loss of the monastery. It was about the nature of the threat. Raiders who came from the sea and vanished before a response could be organized were a problem that existing military structures had no answer for. Frankish cavalry could not ride across water. English furred levies could not be mustered and marched fast enough. The sea itself had become a weapon. For the next several decades, the raids followed a pattern. Norse ships appeared on a coastline, moved against a target, monastery, trading port, royal estate, and withdrew before a defense could form. The targets were chosen well. Monasteries concentrated precious objects in buildings that no one had thought to fortify. Trading ports held silver, cloth, and goods from across Europe. The raiders were not simply greedy, they were systematic. But raids, however profitable, were not the endgame. Silver spent at home bought land, or it bought the means to acquire land somewhere else. What the Norse discovered, in those early decades of probing the coastlines of England, Ireland, and Francia, was that Europe was not merely wealthy. It was also, in many of its kingdoms, deeply unstable. Power was contested, armies were slow, and the people who held authority in these kingdoms had no reliable way to stop men who moved by water. This is the moment where the story changes register, from raid to something larger. The Norse did not have an empire or a plan. What they had was a capability that no one else possessed and an appetite for land that their own country could not satisfy. They were not barbarians crashing against the walls of civilization. They were landless men with the best ships in the world, looking at a continent that could not keep them out. The pattern that would repeat itself across England, Francia, Russia, and the Mediterranean was already visible in embryo in those first decades. Arrive, establish a presence, understand the local power structure. Find the point at which negotiation, or the threat of continued force, produced something more durable than a raid. The Norse were pragmatists. They did not need to destroy what they found. They needed to own it. What began on the shore of Lindisfarne in 793 was not, in any meaningful sense, a series of criminal episodes. It was the opening move of the most consequential migration and political transformation in medieval European history. The men who beached their ships that morning did not know that, but the world they set in motion would take 2 centuries to complete, and its consequences have never entirely ended. England in the middle of the 9th century was not a single kingdom. It was 4, Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the south, each with its own king, its own nobility, and its own capacity to resist or collapse under pressure. The Norse, who had spent decades probing its coastlines, understood this. A kingdom divided against itself was not a fortress, it was an invitation. The raids that had begun in the late 8th century had, by the 860s, changed in character. The longships still came, but what they carried was different. In the autumn of 865, a force that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would call the Great Heathen Army landed on the shores of East Anglia. This was not a raiding party looking for silver. It was an army of conquest assembled from warriors across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, led by commanders who had come to take land and hold it. Among its leaders were Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba, sons, according to Norse saga tradition, of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. Whether the family story was precisely true mattered less than what these men were capable of. They were not raiders thinking in seasons, they were strategists thinking in kingdoms. Their first move was to secure horses from the East Anglian king in exchange for a temporary peace, turning an army of seamen into a mobile land force before anyone had understood what was happening. Within a year they had taken York, the ancient capital of Northumbria. Within 4 years, the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and most of Mercia had fallen before them. King after king was deposed, fled, or died. The great heathen army moved with a speed and coherence that the patchwork English kingdoms, each defending only their own territory, could not match. By 870, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained intact. Only one king had not yet broken. Alfred of Wessex was 21 years old when he inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies and a situation that, by any reasonable assessment, was already lost. He was not in those first years a man of triumph. In the winter of 878, the Norse launched a surprise assault on his stronghold at Chippenham. Alfred escaped into the marshes of Somerset with a handful of followers, reduced to a fugitive in his own kingdom, sheltering in the wetlands while the Danes held his courts and his estates. What followed from that low point is one of the most remarkable reversals in English history. Alfred reorganized his forces, fortified settlements across Wessex into a network of defended towns called burhs, and rebuilt the capacity to resist not just one assault but a sustained campaign. In May of 878, at the Battle of Edington in Wiltshire, he met the Danish leader Guthrum in open battle and won a decisive victory. It was the moment the great heathen army's advance finally stopped. The peace that followed was not the erasure of Norse power in England, it was its formalization. Under the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, England was divided along a line running roughly from London to Chester. To the north and east of that line lay the Danelaw, a vast territory where Norse law, Norse custom, and Norse settlers governed the land. Guthrum converted to Christianity, with Alfred standing as his godfather. The men who had come to destroy the English kingdoms had instead become one half of a divided England. The Danelaw was not simply a military occupation, it was a cultural transplant. Norse settlers moved into the land behind the armies, establishing farms, towns, and communities that carried Scandinavian names: Derby, Grimsby, Whitby, Scunthorpe, Thorpe. Endings that still mark the landscape of northern and eastern England today were Norse words rooted into English soil during this period. The language the settlers spoke entered the English tongue, quietly and permanently, reshaping it from the inside. Alfred's successors spent the next half-century clawing back the Danelaw through patient, grinding military campaigning. His son Edward the Elder and his daughter Aethelflaed of Mercia, a commander of considerable ability in her own right, pushed the frontier steadily northward. Alfred's grandson Athelstan completed the work, winning a decisive battle at Brunanburh in 937 against a coalition of Norse, Scottish, and Strathclyde forces. For a brief moment, England looked like it had finally resolved the Norse question. It had not. The second wave came in the 990s when a weakened English king, Ethelred II, known to history as the Unready, meaning ill-advised, faced a new generation of Norse warriors who had learned from everything the great heathen army had attempted. Rather than fight them, Ethelred paid them. The Danegeld, a tax levied on the English population to buy off Norse raiders, was one of the largest cash transfers in early medieval history, and it solved nothing. It funded the next campaign. In the summer of 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard arrived in England not as a raider but as a conqueror, with a plan and an army to execute it. The north, with its dense Norse-descended population, welcomed him or stood aside. The rest of England collapsed around him with a speed that astonished even his own commanders. Ethelred II fled to Normandy, to the court of the Norse-descended duke, who would, 50 years later, send his own army back across the Channel. Sweyn Forkbeard became King of England. Sweyn died within weeks of his triumph in February 1014, before he could consolidate what he had taken. His son Knut inherited the army and the ambition, but not yet the kingdom. 2 more years of campaigning followed, including a siege of London and a series of hard-fought battles against Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside, before a final agreement partitioned England between them. When Edmund died shortly afterward, Canute became the sole king of England in 1016. He was in his early 20s. He would rule for 19 years, and he would be one of the most formidable monarchs England had ever seen. Knut the Great was not, by the time of his English reign, simply a Viking conqueror holding power by force. He was a statesman. He retained the Anglo-Saxon administrative structure, ruled through English earls alongside his Danish commanders, embraced Christianity with visible conviction, and issued law codes that blended Danish and Anglo-Saxon tradition. He understood that lasting power was not about burning the existing system. It was about taking the seat at its head. By 1028 he ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously, what historians now call the North Sea Empire, making him the most powerful monarch in Western Europe outside the Holy Roman Emperor. The world Knut inhabited was one his grandfather could not have imagined when he first beached a longship on an English shore. The grandson of a pagan raider was receiving letters from the Pope, attending the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, and administering a legal system inherited from Alfred the Great. He had not replaced England's institutions. He had placed himself at their summit and ruled them as if they had always been his. This was not conquest in the ordinary sense. It was absorption, the most complete form of the 4-beat pattern the Norse repeated everywhere they went. Knut died in November 1035, still in his 30s at the height of his power. What followed was a predictable unraveling. His sons lacked his ability, the empire divided. By 1042, the English throne had passed back to a member of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line. Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred II, raised in exile in Normandy. It looked, from the outside, like a restoration. Like the Norse interlude had closed and the Old England had returned. It was not a restoration, it was a pause. Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066. The succession crisis that followed would produce the most consequential year in English history. But the men competing for the throne were not, in any meaningful sense, an Anglo-Saxon king defending his kingdom against foreign invaders. They were the heirs of a century and a half of Norse transformation, fighting over a prize that Norse ambition had already in different ways helped to shape. The final act of the Viking Age in England had not yet begun. It was still coming. What the 200-year Norse engagement with England left behind was not simply a changed map, it was a changed country. The language, the law, the place names, the administrative structures, the very concept of a unified English kingdom, all of it bore the marks of the encounter. Alfred's England had been forged in resistance to the Norse. Knut's England had been governed by them. The England that would face 1066 was neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor purely Scandinavian. It was something new, shaped by the collision of both. And there is one detail, easy to overlook, that captures the full depth of what had happened. When Ethelred II fled England in 1013 before Swine Forkbeard's advance, he did not flee to France, or to Rome, or to any of the traditional courts of Christian Europe. He fled to Normandy, to the protection of a Norse-descended duke whose people had arrived on the Seine barely a century before. One set of Vikings was driving the English king into the arms of another. The world had already changed. Most people living in it had not yet understood how completely. The Danelaw was gone as a political entity by the mid-10th century, but its roots had gone too deep to pull out. Its language had entered English so thoroughly that modern speakers use Old Norse words dozens of times a day without knowing it. They, them, and their are Norse, not Anglo-Saxon. Skin, sky, knife, husband, window, ugly, awkward, all Norse. The most common words in the English language carry, embedded in their syllables, the memory of men who came from Scandinavia and stayed long enough to reshape the tongue of the people they had arrived to conquer. England by the middle of the 11th century was a kingdom that had been raided, partitioned, conquered, ruled, and culturally remade by Norse-descended people over the course of 2 centuries. It had also produced, in Alfred the Great, the one figure capable of holding the line long enough for something recognizably English to survive. That tension between what was preserved and what was transformed is the true story of the Norse in England, not a story of destruction, a story of collision and of what two cultures make when neither one entirely wins. While the Norse were carving out the Danelaw in England, a parallel story was unfolding across the Channel. The Frankish kingdom, the vast realm that Charlemagne had built and his descendants were slowly losing the capacity to hold together, had been absorbing Norse raids since the early 9th century. They came up the rivers, the Loire, the Garonne, and above all the Seine offered undefended highways into the interior of Francia, and the Norse used every one of them. The raid of 845 was the one that announced the scale of what the Frankish kingdom now faced. A Norse fleet under a commander the sources call Regan Harris sailed up the Seine, past the point where any defense had been organized, and arrived at the gates of Paris. The city was not taken. A payment of 7,000 pounds of silver persuaded the fleet to withdraw, but the message it sent was unmistakable. The heart of the Frankish world was reachable. The treasury could be made to pay, and so it would be, repeatedly, for the next 6 decades. The Frankish kings tried everything. They fortified bridges across the Seine to block longships from passing. They raised armies and marched them to the coast. They paid enormous sums in silver, Danegeld by another name, to buy temporary peace from one fleet, only to face another the following season. In 885 and 886, a Norse force besieged Paris itself for nearly a year, held off by the defenders of the city while the Frankish king negotiated rather than fought. Nothing worked for long. The raids resumed, the silver flowed, and the Norse kept coming. Into this exhausted landscape came Rollo, His origins are debated, Norwegian by most accounts, possibly from the Norse communities that had settled in the British Isles. But his capability was not in doubt. By the first decade of the 10th century, he had established a permanent Norse presence along the lower Seine in the territory around Rouen and had made himself the dominant military force in the region. He was not simply raiding anymore. He was settling. And Charles III of West Francia, known to history as Charles the Simple, faced a choice that his predecessors had never quite been willing to make. In the spring of 911, Rollo led a force against the town of Chartres, south of Paris. The assault failed. A Frankish cavalry force drove the Norse back from the walls. But both sides understood the arithmetic. Rollo was beaten at Chartres but unbroken. His army remained intact. More Norse ships and men were not far away. Charles could win individual battles and still lose the war of attrition. The treaty he proposed was not weakness dressed up as strategy. It was clarity about what kind of peace was actually achievable. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, concluded in 911, granted Rollo the territory at the mouth of the Seine, the land around Rouen and the coast to the sea. In exchange, Rollo swore fealty to Charles, accepted baptism and conversion to Christianity, took a Frankish name, Robert, and agreed to defend the Seine against other Norse raiders. The man who had spent years attacking the Frankish kingdom was now contracted to protect it. Charles had not defeated the Norse. He had hired them. The territory Rollo received had no established name. It acquired one from the people who now lived in it. Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The name was honest in a way that few political arrangements are. This was Norse land, held by Norse people, governed by a Norse warlord who had accepted Christian baptism but ruled according to his own code. The conversion was real enough in its external forms, but Rollo did not arrive in 911 as a blank slate ready to become Frankish. He arrived as the commander of a functioning Norse political entity that now had formal territorial recognition. What followed over the next 3 generations was one of the most complete cultural transformations in medieval history and one of the most consequential. The Norse settlers of Normandy intermarried with the Frankish population. They adopted the local Romance language, abandoning Old Norse with a speed that surprised contemporary observers. They embraced Catholicism not merely as a political convenience but as a genuine institutional framework, building churches, endowing monasteries, and aligning themselves with the ecclesiastical structures of the broader Christian world. Within 2 generations, the ruling class of Normandy spoke no Norse at all, but they did not become simply French. What the Norman dukes, Rollo's son William Longsword, his grandson Richard I, built in Normandy was something new. They took Carolingian administrative structures and fused them with Norse concepts of personal loyalty and military obligation. They developed a form of feudal organization that was more tightly disciplined, more hierarchically coherent, and more militarily effective than anything the wider Frankish world had produced. They lost the longship, they gained the armored cavalry charge, and they kept, embedded in their culture, the Norse appetite for expansion. The Duchy of Normandy in the early 11th century was among the most formidable political entities in Western Europe. Its dukes commanded the loyalty of a warrior aristocracy that had been bred, trained, and culturally conditioned for military excellence across 3 generations. They had absorbed the best of Frankish administrative practice and married it to a martial tradition that had no equivalent among their neighbors. The great cathedral city of Rouen, which Rollo's predecessors had looted and burned, was now the capital of a sophisticated, literate, ambitious duchy. There is a detail in the story of Rollo's baptism that later chroniclers could not resist embellishing. According to the terms of the treaty, Rollo was required to kneel and kiss the foot of Charles the Simple as a gesture of submission. Rollo, the story goes, refused to kneel. He instructed one of his men to perform the gesture instead. The man lifted the king's foot to his own lips without bending down, tipping the king backward in the process. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it captures. Rollo accepted the treaty's terms. He accepted baptism and feudal obligation. He did not accept diminishment. The Norman relationship with the broader French kingdom was always one of formal subordination and practical independence. The dukes paid homage to the French crown as required by feudal custom, and then governed Normandy as if the French crown barely existed. They expanded their territory, absorbing the Cotentin Peninsula, pushing into Brittany. Through a combination of military pressure and strategic marriage, they cultivated relationships with the papacy, with neighboring kingdoms, and with the networks of Norse-descended communities across England and the wider Norse world. They were, in the most precise sense, an international aristocracy operating from a French base. By the time William II of Normandy, the man history would call the Conqueror, inherited the duchy in 1035 as a child of 7, Normandy had been a functioning Norse-descended political entity for 124 years. The Norse language was gone. The longships were gone. The pagan religion was gone. What remained, embedded in the culture and in the blood of its ruling class, was the pattern. Arrive, establish, adapt, expand. William would inherit not just a duchy but a method. He would use it on the largest available target. Charles the Simple made his treaty with Rollo believing he had solved the Norse problem on the Seine. He had, in the narrowest sense, done exactly that. There were no more Norse raids on Francia after 9/11. Rollo's Normans defended the river as contracted, and the raids stopped. What Charles had actually done as the century unfolded was something he could not have anticipated. He had given permanent territorial form to a Norse political community, provided it with a century to mature and consolidate, and inadvertently created the most formidable military aristocracy in medieval Europe. The solution to the Viking problem on the Seine was the Norman Conquest of England. It is worth pausing on the geography of what had been accomplished by the early 11th century. Norse-descended rulers or communities now held significant power across England's Danelaw, across the kingdom of Cnut's North Sea Empire, and across the Duchy of Normandy. From the North Sea to the English Channel, the political map of northern Europe bore the fingerprints of Scandinavian expansion, and none of it had required a coordinated Norse strategy. It had required only the consistent application of the same instinct: identify where power is weak, establish a presence, and stay long enough to become the power yourself. The story of Normandy is, in the end, a story about the difference between a raid and a stake. Every Norse fleet that attacked the Seine and withdrew took silver. Rollo took land. Land could be inherited, defended, improved, and passed to sons who would pass it to their sons. The men who had come from Scandinavia with nothing but their ships and their willingness to fight had learned, generation by generation, that the most durable form of power was not the kind you carried away. It was the kind you stayed to build. Normandy was the proof. What it would produce in 1066 was the demonstration. The English language carries the mark of what Normandy built as clearly as it carries the mark of the Danelaw. When the Normans arrived in England after 1066, they brought with them the French their Norse ancestors had adopted on the Seine. The result was a collision between Anglo-Saxon English, Old Norse from the Danelaw, and Norman French, three languages pressing against each other in a single island. The hybrid that emerged from that collision is what we now call the English language. Approximately 30% of its vocabulary descends from Norman French. The language of Rollo's adopted people became the language of William's conquered one. None of this was visible in 9/11, when two men met somewhere along the Epte River and agreed to stop fighting. Charles the Simple wanted peace on the Seine. Rollo wanted land. Both of them got what they asked for. The consequences of their transaction, for England, for the English language, for the political architecture of medieval Europe, unfolded across the next century and a half, driven not by any plan either man could have conceived, but by the simple momentum of what they had set in motion. While Norse warriors and settlers were remaking the political map of England and Francia, a different branch of the same expansion was moving in an entirely different direction, east, not across open ocean but down rivers, the vast, interconnected river systems of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, which offered a water highway stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north all the way to the Black Sea and the Caspian in the south. The Norse who took this road are known to history as the Varangians, and the world they built along it would outlast almost everything the western expansion produced. The Eastern Norse were drawn not primarily by land hunger or the weakness of coastal kingdoms, but by trade. The river routes of the east connected the Baltic to the Islamic world and to Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, the wealthiest and most sophisticated state in the medieval world, whose capital Constantinople sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Furs, amber, wax, and captives from the north could be exchanged for silver, silk, and spices moving north from the markets of Baghdad and Constantinople. The eastern route was, in its early decades, less a story of conquest than of commerce. The Varangians moved south through a landscape of dense forest, wide rivers, and scattered Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribal communities. They established fortified trading posts at key points along the routes, places where goods could be stored, boats could be portaged between river systems, and local populations could be brought into a trading relationship or taxed for passage. These posts were not simply commercial stations, they were the embryonic structures of something larger. The Norse had done this before in the West. They were doing it again in the East, on a continental scale. The Russian Primary Chronicle, a 12th century account compiled by Orthodox monks in Kiev, preserves a story that would become foundational to Russian historical identity. In 862, it records the Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes of the Ladoga region, exhausted by internal conflict, sent a delegation to the Varangians across the sea. Their message was direct. Our land is vast and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule us. Whether the invitation happened exactly as described is debated. What is not debated is that a Varangian leader named Rurik arrived in the region around this time and established himself at Novgorod. Rurik's dynasty, the Rurikids, would govern the lands of the Eastern Slavs for the next 700 years. This is not a footnote in Scandinavian history. It is the founding event of Russian statehood. The Norse chieftain who settled at Novgorod in the 860s was the ancestor of princes and tsars whose line stretched from the Viking Age to the end of the 16th century. The eastern expansion of the Norse in this one consequence alone reshaped a civilization that occupies a sixth of the world's land surface. Rurik's successor, Oleg of Novgorod, completed the next stage of the Eastern project. Around 882, Oleg moved south from Novgorod with a force of Varangians and Slavic warriors, captured Kiev, a more strategically positioned city on the Dnieper River, and made it the capital of a new political entity. He called himself prince, not chieftain. He administered the territory through a network of tribute relationships. He controlled both the northern and southern ends of the great river route. The state he had built became known as Kievan Rus. Its name derived from the Norse word for the Varangians themselves, Rus, and it carried that Norse identity into the very foundations of its existence. The trade route that Kievan Rus controlled was one of the most important commercial arteries of the medieval world. Goods from Scandinavia moved south through Novgorod and Kiev to the Black Sea, then by ship to Constantinople. Goods from the Islamic caliphates and from Byzantium moved north along the same corridor. The Varangians did not simply travel this route, they owned it. They levied tolls, enforced passage, and grew wealthy on the margin between the Baltic and the Mediterranean. Thousands of Arabic silver coins, dirhams, found in Scandinavian graves and hoards, record the wealth that flowed back along this road from the markets of the East. Constantinople itself exercised a powerful gravitational pull on the Varangians. They called it Miklagarthar, the great city, and their responses to it ranged across the full spectrum of possible reactions to encountering the most sophisticated urban civilization in the medieval world. They raided it, they traded with it, they negotiated treaties with it, they entered its service. The Byzantine Empire's relationship with the Varangians was complicated, commercially lucrative, occasionally violent, and ultimately resolved in the most Norse way possible. The empire hired them. The formal establishment of the Varangian Guard dates to 988, when the Byzantine Emperor Basil II faced a dangerous internal rebellion and urgently needed reliable troops whose loyalty to him was unquestionable. He appealed to Prince Vladimir I of Kiev, grandson of Rurik's successor, now a baptized Christian, who sent him 6,000 Norse Slavic warriors. These men crushed the rebellion. Basil retained them. The unit they formed, the Varangian Guard, became the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor, stationed within the walls of the great palace of Constantinople, and it remained a fixture of Byzantine imperial life for the next 3 centuries. The Varangian Guard was not simply a military unit, it was a statement about the nature of power in Constantinople. In a court defined by intricate factional politics, where the loyalty of Greek-speaking generals and aristocrats was always potentially in question, the Norse guardsmen offered something the Byzantine system could not easily produce internally. Men who owed their position entirely to the emperor, spoke a different language, had no family connections to any Byzantine faction, and were paid well enough to have no reason to switch sides. They held the keys to the palace prison. They stood at the emperor's shoulder in processions. They were the visible proof of his personal authority. The Varangians in Constantinople left physical evidence of their presence that survives to this day. In the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral at the heart of Byzantine civilization, one of the most extraordinary buildings ever constructed. Norse runic inscriptions are scratched into the marble of the balustrade. A Varangian guardsman, standing at his post during an imperial ceremony, carved his name into the stone of the most sacred building in the Christian East. The casual intimacy of the gesture captures something essential. These men were not guests in Constantinople, they were its garrison. Among the most remarkable figures to pass through the Varangian Guard was a Norwegian prince named Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, meaning Harold the Hard Ruler. He arrived in Constantinople as a young man in the 1030s, rose to command the Varangian Guard, fought campaigns across the Byzantine Empire from the Caucasus to Sicily, and accumulated enough wealth and military experience to return to Scandinavia and eventually claim the throne of Norway. He ruled it for 20 years. Then, in the autumn of 1066, he launched an invasion of England. He was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge 3 weeks before William of Normandy landed at Hastings. Harald Hardrada was simultaneously the last great Viking king and a former officer of the Byzantine imperial household. The story of the Varangians in the East is, in its structure, a replication of the pattern established in England and Francia, but stretched across a vastly larger geography and a much longer time horizon. The Norse arrived as outsiders moving along a route that offered profit. They established footholds that became permanent. They intermarried with local populations. They converted to the dominant religion in the East, Eastern Orthodox Christianity rather than Roman Catholicism, and they produced a ruling class that was, within 2 or 3 generations, indistinguishable from the people it governed, except that it sat at the top of the hierarchy. Prince Vladimir I of Kiev, who sent the 6,000 warriors to Basil II in 988, was himself a great-grandson of Rurik, a Norse chieftain's descendant who now ruled a Slavic state, corresponded with the Byzantine emperor as an equal, and in that same year, 988, converted Kievan Rus to Orthodox Christianity in a mass baptism in the Dnieper River. The Norse who had come east as pagan traders navigating rivers for silver had, within 5 generations, become the Christian rulers of one of the largest states in Europe, aligned with the most ancient Christian empire in the world. The 4-beat pattern, arrive, establish, convert, absorb, had played out in the East exactly as it had in the West, only the scale was different. The Eastern expansion also produced a detail of near-perfect historical symmetry. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, many of the Anglo-Saxon English who had lost their country to the Norman invasion found their way, over the following decades, to Constantinople and the Varangian Guard. The unit that had been predominantly Norse in its founding generation became, in the late 11th century, predominantly Anglo-Saxon. English warriors who had been displaced by William the Conqueror's Norse-descended army ended up serving as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, alongside and eventually replacing the Norse warriors whose kinsmen had just dispossessed them. The irony was total. The Norse expansion in its eastern theater eventually provided a refuge for its own western victims. What the Varangian story adds to the larger argument of this documentary is the proof that the Norse pattern was not circumstantial. It was not the product of particular conditions in England or Francia that happened to favor Norse political success. It was a repeatable capability that operated across different geographies, different cultures, different religions, and different centuries. From Lindisfarne to Novgorod, from the Seine to the Dnieper, from the English Channel to the Bosphorus, the same instinct produced the same result. arrive with force, establish a presence, adapt to the local system, become its rulers. The Varangian Guard, standing at the shoulder of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, was the easternmost expression of a process that had begun on the North Sea coast of England in 793. The rivers of the East also carried the Norse into commercial contact with the Islamic world, at a moment when that world was the most economically dynamic civilization on earth. The dirhams, Arabic silver coins, that flowed north along the Volga route and ended up buried in Scandinavian hoards, represent one of the large monetary flows of the early medieval period. Norse traders reached Baghdad, they reached the Caspian. They carried goods that connected Scandinavia to the Silk Road. The Viking Age was not, in its eastern dimension, primarily a story of warfare. It was a story of how a seafaring culture with exceptional navigational skill inserted itself into the most profitable trade corridor of the medieval world and profited from it for 2 centuries. By the time the Varangian Guard was formally established in 988, the Norse presence in the east had been building for over a century. Rurik's founding of Novgorod, Oleg's capture of Kiev, the Rurikid dynasty's absorption into Slavic political culture, the trade routes humming with silver and furs, all of it was already in place. What 988 added was the final, most dramatic expression: Norse axemen in the palace of the Emperor of the Romans, guarding the most powerful throne in the Christian world. The men who had started with longships and land hunger had ended up at the center of the world's most ancient empire, and in the West, something even larger was about to happen. Edward the Confessor, King of England, died on the 5th of January 1066 without a direct heir. He had ruled for 23 years, a quiet and pious man who had spent much of his life in exile in Normandy. In the court, it bears remembering of the Norse-descended dukes whose people had sheltered him when the Danish king Svein Forkbeard drove his father from England 40 years before. The succession crisis his childless death created would produce the most consequential year in English history. But it was not, at its root, an Anglo-Saxon story. It was a Norse story in its final act. 3 men immediately claimed or were positioned to claim the English throne. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, was elected king by the English nobility and crowned within 24 hours of Edward's death. He was capable, experienced, and politically connected, but his claim rested on an election rather than blood. Harald Hardrada of Norway pressed a claim rooted in the old agreements between the Danish and Norwegian crowns over the English succession, a claim inherited, ultimately, from the Viking kingships of Knut the Great, and William, Duke of Normandy, pressed a claim he said Edward himself had promised him years before. 2 of these 3 men were Norse by descent. The third was fighting to defend a kingdom that 2 centuries of Norse engagement had already transformed beyond recognition. Harald Hardrada moved first. In the late summer of 1066, he assembled a fleet of around 300 ships and sailed for England with an army of Norwegian warriors. He was joined off the Scottish coast by Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, exiled from his earldom in Northumbria the previous year and burning with resentment. The coalition of the Norwegian king and the English earl's renegade brother was not simply a political alliance of convenience. It was the latest expression of the deep interpenetration of Norse and English political life that 2 centuries of shared history had produced. Hardrada's army sailed up the Humber estuary and then the River Ouse, driving deep into Yorkshire. At the Battle of Fulford Gate on the 20th of September, they met and defeated an English force led by the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia. York, the old Viking capital of the Danelaw, the city that Danish armies had held for generations, opened its gates. Hardrada accepted terms, arranged for the city to supply his forces, and withdrew his army to Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent to await the delivery of hostages from the surrounding countryside. He had moved through northern England with the confidence of a man who believed the North remembered him. Harold Godwinson had spent the summer months on the south coast, holding his army in readiness for the Norman invasion he knew was coming from across the Channel. When news of Hardrada's landing reached him, he faced a decision that had no good answer. He chose the north. He assembled his household troops and as many men as he could move quickly, and he marched from London to Yorkshire, a distance of nearly 200 miles, in 4 days. It was one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval military history, driven by a commander who understood that speed was his only meaningful advantage. The Norwegians at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September 1066 were not expecting him. It was a warm autumn day, and many of the Norse warriors had left their armor in the ships at Recall, several miles away. When Harold's army appeared on the road from York, there was a moment preserved in later saga tradition, when a single English rider approached the Norse lines and offered Tostig the return of his earldom if he would abandon Hardrada. Tostig asked what England would offer Hardrada. The reply, attributed to Harold Godwinson himself, was precise and unsparing: enough English earth for a grave, or perhaps a little more, since he stood taller than most men. The battle that followed was fierce and costly, but its outcome was never seriously in doubt. Harold's forces, fresher in spirit if exhausted in body from the march, broke through the Norse position. Harald Hardrada, former commander of the Varangian Guard, king of Norway for 20 years, the last great Viking king in the old tradition, fell on the field. Tostig died with him. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norse army to England, fewer than 25 were needed to carry the survivors home. England had defeated its Viking invasion. Harold Godwinson had done what no English king since Alfred had quite managed to do. He had broken a Norse army in open battle and sent it back across the sea. He had 3 days to absorb the victory. On the 28th of September, William of Normandy's fleet landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. The Norman invasion had begun. Harold now faced the decision that would define his reign and end his life: march south immediately before his army had recovered, or wait and rest. He chose speed. It was the same instinct that had served him in the north. This time it would not. William of Normandy in 1066 was 38 years old. He had been duke since he was 7, had survived a turbulent and dangerous minority in which multiple attempts had been made against his life, and had spent 3 decades building Normandy into the most disciplined military force in Western Europe. He was, by any assessment, one of the most formidable commanders of his age. He was also, in the precise lineage of his blood, the great-great-great-grandson of the Viking warlord Rollo, the man who had been given the Seine Valley by Charles the Simple in 911 and turned it into a duchy. The Conqueror was Norse. He simply did not speak the language anymore. The Norman army that waited for Harold on the slopes below Senlac Hill was not a French army in any meaningful ethnic sense. It was a Norse-descended military aristocracy that had spent 150 years absorbing Frankish administrative sophistication and cavalry warfare while retaining, in its culture and its appetite, the expansionist instinct of its Viking forebears. It fought differently from its ancestors, on horseback, with lances, supported by archers, but it was motivated by the same fundamental drive. These were men who had come from somewhere else and intended to own what they found. The Battle of Hastings was fought on the 14th of October 1066. It lasted all day, unusually long for a medieval engagement, as Harold's Anglo-Saxon infantry held their position on the ridge behind interlocked shields while the Norman cavalry charged repeatedly uphill and Norman archers fired into the English ranks. At some point in the late afternoon, Harold fell, the exact manner of his death disputed by sources then and historians since. What is not disputed is that when he fell, the English position collapsed. The road to London was open. England had a new king. William was crowned on Christmas Day 1066 in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was conducted in both English and French. When the assembled congregation shouted their acclamation, the traditional response of consent, the Norman soldiers standing guard outside the abbey heard the noise and, apparently misreading it as the beginning of a revolt, set fire to nearby buildings. Even in the moment of his coronation, William's England was a place where 2 worlds had not yet learned to trust each other. They would spend the next century working out the terms of their coexistence. What followed the coronation was systematic and deliberate. William distributed the lands of the Anglo-Saxon nobility among his Norman followers. Within 20 years, the entire landowning class of England had been replaced. Approximately 1,000 Anglo-Saxon landowners had been reduced to virtually none, displaced, driven into exile, or reduced to tenancy on land their families had held for generations. A new Norman aristocracy settled across England, built castles at strategic points, imposed the feudal structures refined in Normandy, and conducted the affairs of government in French. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1086, was the administrative expression of total conquest, a survey of every significant piece of property in England, organized for taxation and control. The framing that history has applied to 1066, Norman versus Anglo-Saxon, French versus English, continental versus island, misses the deeper structure of what actually happened. England in 1066 was a kingdom that had already been transformed by 2 centuries of Norse engagement. Its language carried Old Norse embedded in its most basic vocabulary. Its northern and eastern landscape was mapped in Norse place names. Its administrative structures had been shaped by Alfred's response to the Norse threat and Knut's adaptation of Anglo-Saxon governance. The country that William conquered was not a pristine Anglo-Saxon realm disrupted by an outside force. It was already a hybrid, and William was adding one more Norse layer to a structure that Norse influence had already partly built. There is a detail about 1066 that the conventional framing almost never mentions, and it deserves to be named directly. Both of the invasion forces that contested England in the autumn of that year. Hardrada's Norwegian army from the north, William's Norman army from the south, were Viking in their ultimate origin. Harold Godwinson defeated one Viking successor state at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September. He was defeated by another Viking successor state at Hastings on the 14th of October. England in 1066 was not conquered by the French. It was fought over by 2 different expressions of Norse ambition, separated by the century and a half it had taken each of them to transform themselves into something their Scandinavian grandfathers would not have recognized. The man who rode into London in the autumn of 1066 as King of England was the direct descendant of a Norse chieftain who could not read, spoke no Latin, and arrived on the Seine in a longship. 5 generations of transformation, conversion, intermarriage, language shift, cultural absorption separated Rollo from William, but the lineage was unbroken and the pattern was the same: arrive from outside, establish a foothold, convert and adapt, take the seat of power. William the Conqueror was not the end of the Viking Age. He was its most complete product. The consequences of 1066 for the English language alone would reshape the cultural history of the English-speaking world. Norman French arrived in England as the language of the new ruling class and stayed for 3 centuries as the language of law, government, literature, and elite life. It fused with the Anglo-Saxon English already shaped by 2 centuries of Old Norse influence from the Danelaw. The result of that collision, Anglo-Saxon grammar carrying Old Norse vocabulary alongside Norman French words for power, governance, and culture, is what eventually became the English language. Approximately 30% of modern English vocabulary descends from Norman French. The language of the world's largest literary tradition was partly forged in the crucible of Norse expansion. Harald Hardrada and William the Conqueror never met. They moved toward the same prize from opposite directions, and the accident of chronology determined which of them would reach it. If Hardrada had not forced Harold north in September, Harold's army would have been rested and prepared to meet William on the Sussex coast with its full strength. If Harold had not pushed south immediately after Stamford Bridge, he might have recovered in time to fight on better terms. History is not made only by the grand forces that shape civilizations. It is also made by the weather that kept William's fleet in harbor through August and September, by the forced march that exhausted an army that had just won a victory, and by the arrow or the cavalry charge, accounts differ, that ended the life of the last Anglo-Saxon king of England on a ridge in Sussex on an October afternoon. William's coronation on Christmas Day 1066 was not the end of Norse influence on England, it was its culmination. The England that emerged from 1066, Norman ruled, French-speaking at court, Old Norse in its place names and its common vocabulary, Anglo-Saxon in its legal traditions and its rural life, was the most complete expression of what 2 centuries of Norse engagement had produced. It was a country that could not have existed without the Vikings. It simply did not look like one anymore. And that, in the end, is what makes 1066 the pivot point of the entire story. Not because it was the moment the Vikings won, but because it was the moment they became invisible. Absorbed so completely into the fabric of the country they had transformed that the transformation itself could be forgotten. The Norman Conquest is remembered as the moment England became something new. What is rarely said is that the men who made it new were the grandsons of the men who had been making it new for 200 years already. The Viking Age did not end in 1066, it completed itself. There is a version of the Viking story that ends at Hastings, Norse ambition exhausted, the expansion complete, the map redrawn and settled. That version is wrong. At the same moment that William the Conqueror was consolidating his grip on England, a separate group of Norse-descended adventurers was doing something even more improbable 3,000 miles to the south. They were building a kingdom in Sicily, ruling over Arabs, Greeks, and Latins simultaneously, in a land that most of them had arrived in as hired soldiers with nothing to their names. Southern Italy in the early 11th century was one of the most politically fragmented regions in Europe. The Byzantine Empire held the toe and heel of the Italian boot. The territories of Apulia and Calabria, through a thin administrative network of governors and garrisons. Lombard principalities occupied the interior, warring with each other and occasionally with the Byzantines. Sicily itself had been under Arab rule for over 2 centuries, a prosperous and sophisticated Islamic society that had made the island one of the wealthiest territories in the western Mediterranean. Into this complicated landscape, the first Normans arrived around 1016, not as conquerors but as mercenaries. The story of how they got there carries the unmistakable imprint of Norse opportunism. A group of Norman pilgrims returning from Jerusalem stopped in southern Italy, where a Lombard lord appealed to them for military help against the Byzantines. They assisted. They were good at it. Word spread. More Normans came south, landless younger sons from Norman families. Men who had heard that there was fighting to be done and land to be won in the warm south, and who needed neither a formal invitation nor a detailed plan. They hired themselves out to whoever needed soldiers and used the payments to establish footholds. The family that would ultimately drive the Norman conquest of the south was the Hautevilles, the sons of a minor Norman lord named Tancred, who had more sons than land to distribute among them. One after another, the brothers of the Hauteville family made the journey south, each building on what the previous one had established. By the 1040s, the eldest surviving brother, William, who earned the nickname Iron Arm after reportedly meeting an Arab emir of Syracuse in single combat and prevailing, had become a significant military force in Apulia. The mercenary phase was ending. The conquest phase was beginning. Robert de Hauteville, the 6th son of Tancred, arrived in southern Italy around 1047 with a horse, armor, and the kind of ruthless clarity about what he wanted that his contemporaries apparently found both admirable and alarming. His nickname was Guiscard, from the Old French for the cunning one, or the fox. He arrived with almost nothing. Within a decade, he was the dominant military power in Apulia. Within 2 decades, he held a papal investiture as Duke of Apulia and Calabria, a formal recognition by the most powerful religious institution in the Western world that this Norse-descended adventurer was now the legitimate ruler of a major Italian territory. The pattern, by now familiar, was operating again. Robert Guiscard arrived from outside the existing power structure with force and capability. He established himself by making himself useful to various Lombard factions first, then increasingly on his own terms. He converted already. He was Catholic, as all Normans were by this point, and he aligned himself with the reformed papacy that was reshaping the institutional landscape of 11th century Europe. Pope Nicholas II invested him as duke in 1059 not because he had been invited, but because the papacy needed a military protector in the south, and Guiscard was the most powerful man available. The Norse instinct, arrive, establish, align with existing authority, absorb, had found its Mediterranean expression. While Robert consolidated the mainland, his younger brother Roger turned his attention to Sicily itself. The island lay barely 3 miles off the tip of Calabria, visible from the Italian shore on a clear day, and it had been in Arab hands since the 9th century. Roger began his campaign to take it in 1061 with a modest force, a night crossing, a rapid advance, and the capture of a foothold on the northeastern tip of the island near Messina. What followed was 30 years of grinding, intermittent warfare across a large and complex island against an Arab population that was better established and more sophisticated than almost any enemy the Normans had previously faced. The conquest of Sicily was completed by 1091. Roger I, Robert Guiscard's brother, had done what no Christian ruler had managed since the Arab conquest 2 centuries before. He had taken the island back, but what he did with it was not what most conquerors of the era would have done. He did not expel the Arab population. He did not dismantle the Islamic administrative and legal structures that governed the island's Muslim majority. He governed through them. Arab officials administered Arab communities. Greek Orthodox clergy governed their congregations. The Norman rulers sat at the top of a structure they had not built and made no attempt to replace. It was Roger I's son, Roger II, who transformed this pragmatic accommodation into something unprecedented in medieval Europe. Crowned King of Sicily on Christmas Day 1130, Roger II ruled a kingdom that conducted government business in 4 languages, simultaneously Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Norman French. His chief minister was a Greek from Antioch. His court geographer was the Arab scholar Al-Idrisi, whose world map, the Tabula Rogeriana, was the most accurate cartographic representation of the known world produced in the 12th century. His palace in Palermo was decorated with Byzantine mosaics, Arab geometric tilework, and Norman architectural forms, all existing in the same building without apparent contradiction. The mosaic portrait of Roger II that survives in the Church of La Martorana in Palermo shows a king dressed in Byzantine imperial robes, being crowned not by a pope or a patriarch, but by Christ himself. The standard iconography of Byzantine imperial legitimacy, deployed by a Norse-descended Norman who ruled over Arabs and Latins and spoke, by some accounts, 4 languages. The image captures the full strangeness of what the Norman kingdom of Sicily actually was. It was not a simple conquest. It was a cultural synthesis operated by men who had learned, in Normandy and before that in Scandinavia, that the fastest way to legitimacy was to become indistinguishable from the authority you had replaced. The court at Palermo under Roger II was, by the assessment of contemporary observers and modern historians alike, the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan royal court in 12th century Europe. Philosophers, mathematicians, poets, and scientists from the Arab, Greek, and Latin worlds gathered there. Scholars translated Arabic texts on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy into Latin, transmissions that would contribute to the intellectual awakening of medieval European universities in the following century. The knowledge of ancient Greece had been preserved in Arabic, and it flowed back into Western Europe, partly through the multicultural conduit of a kingdom founded by the descendants of Norse pirates. There is a detail in the early Norman presence in Sicily that connects this southern theater to the eastern story told in Act 4, and it is not a detail that most histories mention. Among the forces that participated in the earliest Byzantine campaigns in Sicily in the 1030s and 1040s were members of the Varangian Guard. Harald Hardrada himself served in this campaign before he returned north to claim the Norwegian throne. The same Norse military culture that produced the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor also produced the mercenaries who began the Norman foothold in Sicily. The theaters of Norse expansion were not separate stories. They were expressions of the same world, carried by men who often knew each other. The Norman kingdom of Sicily endured in various forms until the 19th century. The dynasty that Roger II founded governed an island at the crossroads of 3 civilizations, European, Arab, and Byzantine, and left traces in Sicilian culture, architecture, language, and law that are still visible today. The Cathedral of Monreale, completed in 1189, fuses Norman architecture with Byzantine mosaics covering 14,000 square meters of interior surface, depicting the entire narrative of Christian scripture in gold tesserae applied by craftsmen working in a tradition that stretched back to Constantinople. It was built by the great-grandson of Roger I, a man of Norman descent, ruling in the Mediterranean, presiding over a kingdom that would have been entirely unrecognizable to the Scandinavian warriors who began the whole story. Sicily was the proof, not the proof that the Norse were uniquely gifted as rulers, or that their culture was superior to those they governed. There is no argument of that kind to be made. The proof was simpler and more powerful than that. The Norse expansion was not the product of particular circumstances in particular places. It was a repeatable capability. In England, in Francia, in Russia, in Byzantium, and now in Sicily, the same pattern had produced the same outcome across radically different geographies, cultures, and centuries. A people with exceptional mobility, no attachment to existing power structures, and an instinct for pragmatic accommodation had inserted themselves into the most valuable positions available in each theater they entered. Sicily was the southernmost expression of a process that had begun on the North Sea coast of England in 793. The pattern held all the way to Palermo. The Norman kingdom of Sicily also illustrates, with particular clarity, what distinguished the Norse expansion from ordinary conquest. Ordinary conquest replaces what it finds. The Norman kingdom of Sicily preserved what it found and governed it. The Arab population farmed, traded, and administered as they had before. The Greek population worshipped and conducted commerce as they had before. The new element was not a replacement of the existing order, but a new apex positioned above it, a ruling dynasty that collected the surplus of a sophisticated multi-ethnic economy and deployed it toward cultural patronage, military expansion, and political consolidation. It was governance as arbitrage, extract value from diversity rather than eliminate it. And then there is the final symmetry that the Sicilian story offers. When Robert Guiscard's Norman forces clashed with Byzantine armies in southern Italy and the Balkans in the 1070s and 1080s, as Guiscard pushed his ambitions toward Constantinople itself, the Byzantine army he faced contained among its units the Varangian Guard. Anglo-Saxon warriors who had fled England after William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings and taken service with the Byzantine emperor were now fighting on the other side of the battlefield, from the Norman descendants of the same Norse expansion that had driven them from their homeland. The Viking Age had produced, in its final decades, a situation in which men of Norse descent on both sides of a Mediterranean war were fighting men whose displacement was itself a consequence of Norse expansion. The world had folded back on itself. Will Durant spent 50 years trying to understand how civilizations move, how power shifts, how cultures are transmitted, how one world ends and another begins. His central observation, drawn from the full sweep of recorded history, was that civilization is not a possession permanently held. It is a condition periodically disrupted, reorganized, and rebuilt by forces that the existing order never fully anticipates. The Norse expansion was one of the most complete demonstrations of that principle in the medieval world. A people with no empire, no bureaucracy, and no diplomatic standing reshaped the political architecture of a continent in 2 centuries. And then they disappeared, not by being destroyed, but by becoming the thing they had entered. Stand back far enough from the detail and the shape of what happened becomes clear. In 793, a Norse longship beached on Lindisfarne and the world of the early medieval North began to change. By 1130, when Roger II was crowned King of Sicily in a ceremony conducted in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, wearing Byzantine imperial robes, in a cathedral decorated with Arab geometric art and Norman stonework, the transformation was complete. 337 years separated those 2 moments. In its span, the Norse had not simply raided Europe. They had reorganized it. The English monarchy traces its institutional foundations to the collision between Alfred's Wessex and the great heathen army. Without the Norse threat, Alfred would not have needed to build the burhs, the fortified towns that became the administrative backbone of a unified English state. Without the Danish conquest of Connaught, England would not have been absorbed into the most powerful maritime empire in the North Sea world. Without the Norman Conquest of 1066, the English legal system, the English aristocracy, and the English language itself would all have taken fundamentally different forms. The England that exists today, its institutions, its class structures, its tongue, is in measurable ways a product of Norse engagement. The French state tells a parallel story. The Duchy of Normandy was not simply a Norse foothold in France. It was a political laboratory in which the Norse instinct for military organization fused with Carolingian administrative sophistication to produce a new kind of feudal state, more disciplined, more hierarchically coherent, more capable of projecting power at a distance than anything the Frankish world had previously built. The feudal system that governed England for centuries after 1066 was not an Anglo-Saxon invention. It was a Norman import, and the Normans were Norse. Russia presents the most geographically vast consequence. The name of the country itself descends from the Norse word for the Varangians, Rus. The Rurikid dynasty that Rurik founded at Novgorod in the 860s governed the lands of the Eastern Slavs for 700 years, from the Viking Age to the end of the 16th century. The legal codes of Kievan Rus, the administrative structures of the early Russian state, the trade networks that connected the Baltic to Constantinople and Baghdad, all of it was built on a foundation laid by Norse traders and warriors, who moved south along the rivers of Eastern Europe in search of silver and stayed to build a civilization. Russia's national mythology reaches back to a Viking chieftain. Most Russians do not know this. Byzantium tells a different version of the same story. The Norse did not found the Byzantine Empire or reshape its institutions in any lasting way. The empire was too old, too vast, and too deeply rooted to be reorganized by mercenaries, however formidable. What the Varangians gave Byzantium was something more specific and more revealing. The one unit in its army whose loyalty to the emperor was structurally guaranteed. For 3 centuries, the personal security of the most powerful Christian monarch in the world rested on the shoulders of Scandinavian axemen. The Byzantine emperor trusted Norse warriors more than he trusted his own Greek-speaking generals. That trust was not misplaced. The Varangian Guard never broke faith with the throne it served, and Sicily, the most improbable theater of all, tells the story in its most concentrated form. A handful of landless Norman adventurers arrived in southern Italy as hired soldiers and ended up governing a kingdom that produced the most accurate world map of the 12th century, employed the leading Arab geographer of the age, fused Byzantine mosaics with Norman architecture in buildings that still stand, and transmitted Greek scientific knowledge, preserved in Arabic, translated into Latin, into the intellectual bloodstream of medieval European universities. The Norse expansion in its Sicilian expression contributed to the intellectual conditions that made the Renaissance possible. None of this was planned. There was no Norse strategy for Europe, no council of Scandinavian chieftains who sat down in the 8th century and divided the continent among themselves. What there was, instead, was a consistent pattern of individual and small group behavior, repeated across a century and a half and across a continent, that produced consequences far larger than any single actor could have intended. This is one of Durant's deepest lessons from history, that the great transformations are rarely the product of grand design. They are the accumulated result of thousands of small decisions made by people who were mostly just trying to get land, silver, and a position in the world. The pattern itself, arrive, establish, convert, absorb, was not a conscious strategy. It was the natural behavior of pragmatic people inserting themselves into existing power structures. The Norse converted to Christianity not because they had been philosophically persuaded of its truth, but because Christianity was the operating system of European power. It controlled land grants, legitimized rulers, administered populations, and connected courts to one another across the continent. A Norse chieftain who remained pagan was a raider with a fleet. A Norse chieftain who accepted baptism was a potential duke. The mathematics were straightforward. They converted. The speed of cultural transformation in every Norse-settled territory is one of the most striking features of the expansion. Within 2 generations, the Norse settlers of Normandy spoke no Old Norse. Within 3 generations, the Rurikid rulers of Kievan Rus were indistinguishable from Slavic princes in everything except their dynastic name. Within 4 generations, the Norman kings of Sicily were issuing documents in Arabic. The Norse did not impose their culture on the peoples they entered. They absorbed the local culture, adopted its language and religion and administrative forms, and placed themselves at the apex of a structure they had not built. They were, in this sense, the most efficient conquerors in medieval European history, because they left almost nothing that looked like conquest. That invisibility is the most important thing to understand about the Norse legacy. the English speaker, who says they, them, and their. Pronouns borrowed wholesale from Old Norse into a language that did not previously have them in that form, is using Viking vocabulary without knowing it. The modern citizen of Russia living in a country whose very name, from a Norse word for the Varangians, is standing inside a Norse legacy without any awareness of it. The tourist who visits the Cathedral of Monreale in Sicily and stands before 14,000 square meters of Byzantine gold mosaic in a building commissioned by the great-grandson of a Norse adventurer who arrived in Italy with a horse and a sword, is looking at the endpoint of a process that began on a North Sea coast in 793. Durant observed that history does not move in straight lines or according to conscious plan. It moves through the accumulation of pressures, opportunities, and responses, through the behavior of people who are mostly just trying to survive and improve their position, and who occasionally, by the force of their capability and the luck of their timing, change the world beyond all recognition. The Norse expansion is a perfect instance of this observation. The men who beached at Lindisfarne in 793 were not thinking about the fate of European civilization. They were thinking about the silver in the monastery. The consequences of their action, multiplied across 2 centuries and a dozen theaters, were incalculably larger than anything they could have imagined. The conventional story of the Viking Age ends with its closure. The Norman Conquest of 1066, marking the moment the age of Norse expansion, concludes and medieval Europe settles into its established forms. This is wrong in almost every way that matters. The Norse expansion did not close in 1066, it completed itself. The men who had spent 2 centuries arriving, establishing, converting, and absorbing were, by the mid-11th century, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the continent they had entered that the expansion became invisible. The Vikings did not end. They became England, France, Russia, Sicily, and the bodyguard of Byzantium. They became the Middle Ages. Consider what medieval Europe looked like in the year 1100, a century after the traditional close of the Viking Age, a generation after Hastings, a decade before the First Crusade. England was governed by Norman kings who spoke French and traced their lineage to a Norse warlord on the Seine. Normandy was a duchy of Norse descent that had become the most powerful feudal entity in France. Kievan Rus was a state founded by Norse traders, ruled by a dynasty of Norse origin, aligned with Byzantium through conversion to Orthodox Christianity. Sicily was governed by Norse-descended Norman kings who spoke 4 languages and patronized the most cosmopolitan court in Western Europe. The Varangian Guard still stood at the shoulder of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. 5 of the most consequential political entities in the medieval world bore the direct imprint of Norse expansion. The Viking Age had not ended. It had institutionalized itself.